off with a personal question. What is your history with active transportation issues? Bicycling, walking.
Well, I guess it depends on where I've lived. So when I lived in New York City, I took the bus, the M104, to work every day. Which was a beautiful thing. It was one of these buses that not only went south, but then went to the east, other than the west side, and so it had one of those routes. And it was so miraculous when I found that it stopped directly across the street from the building I worked in. So fantastic. So I loved it, and when I've lived elsewhere where there was a great subway, I take the subway everywhere. Right. Here I've been a driver because we're building out the transportation system, but I'm looking forward to taking the light rail, as I'm sure you are, soon.
Right. So, I mean, you were on the Santa Monica City Council, and during that time, how were you active around those issues?
Well, as you know, we tried to do a lot of work with bike lanes.
Right.
Tried to install them as frequently as possible, and we ran the Big Blue Bus system, where we tried to put very environmentally friendly buses to work, and tried to manage the route system and the transfer policy, which I think is a big issue. Manage the transfer policy in a way that enabled people to ride more cheaply.
How involved were you with the bike action plan? Because that was done under while you were on the...
That, I think, was done primarily by staff. I was involved to the extent that I think that everybody knew I was going to approve it. And I know a lot of activists worked hard on it, and I tried to always make clear to them that I was strongly in favor of bike transportation. I'm a bicyclist myself, although I don't ride the bike to work. I like to ride, and I'm very aware of the danger that people face while riding in LA. And
So when was the last time you rode a bike?
Yesterday.
Did you do it for recreation or?
Yeah, yesterday I did it for fun.
Let's talk about Metro's mission. So how does Metro, if you're elected, you'll sit on the board. How does Metro's mission address mobility needs for people who just don't have cars, right? You're saying right now we're building out the system, but... Well,
in the same way that systems in other cities address that. I mean, the obvious example is New York City, where I lived for many, many years without a car, and took the bus to work every day. So it was in the subway when you had to go. So it's pretty easy, if there's a built-out great public transportation system, to not have a car. I know it's easy because I've done it. Doing it here is a little bit maybe tougher because people are so used to the cars. But I think the ridership on existing lines has been fantastic. So a lot of people believe that they wouldn't have fantastic ridership, but we have had. The Orange Line in the valleys had capacity, as people say. It's much more successful than anybody imagined. And there's tremendous demand for it, particularly among young people. So I hope young people will vote, and I hope that we build the system out as quickly as possible here.
So you brought up the Orange Line, and then it's at capacity. Should the Orange Line be converted to light rail?
Well, I've read on your blog opposing views about that.
Yeah,
and that blog is pretty smart. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of smart people on that blog. In fact, for my purposes, it's the most interesting discussion of that issue is on that blog. And having read the back and forth on there, I think it's a challenging question. I mean, I know many people in the Valley want it converted because they want the light rail, but there's a lot of opinion on your blog that it actually will be faster if it's not converted to light rail because the buses can run faster. So I'm looking forward to studying that carefully. What I think is most important is the Valley get its so-called fair share of transportation funding, including the existing Measure R funding and the son of Measure R when that comes along, that specific amounts of money are allocated to specific projects in the Valley that people out there want. I'm very strong, as you know from my service here, looking to local people for local solutions. I don't think the policy should be made downtown and shipped out to Agoura Hills or Van Nuys or Encino. I think we should go to Van Nuys and Encino and ask people what they want, and particularly the activists on your blog who have really studied matters. I look forward to actually meeting some of those people in person and hearing the back and forth. I like to hear the back and forth and figure out from the local people up what the smart solutions are, not from the top down.
what are your priorities based on what you've heard for transportation improvements in the valley?
Well, if you talk to people in general meet and greets, not on your blog, people want the light rail and the orange line. So they just want it. So right now, as I'm sitting here, I think that's a priority. The north-south connectors, they also want. The biggest near-term thing that I think should be done in the near term is to give all the college students, community college students, like the CSUN students, like as we did in Santa Monica, pass to ride free on Metro. I think the idea of having to go downtown, show an ID, get a special card so you can buy a pass for $25 a month is crazy. You know, I think you should just ride free with your college ID. I think that will relieve a tremendous amount of one-on-one traffic. I think it would boost the ridership on the existing bus lines, and it would bring people into the system who could then become activists for the system and route designations and other matters. I think that could be done in the near term. I think it would be great. In fact, I think it would be great on a county-wide basis. And I know everybody goes, well, you know, we've got to study 16 things. I mean, we did it, as you know, in Santa Monica, and it seems to have worked out pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Right. Yeah, and of course you need the fact that Santa Monica Community College
yes.
Students can ride free on the Big Blue bus.
That's right, with only their ID. They don't have to go somewhere, take a fingerprint test. And,
right, so there's fewer barriers.
There's no barriers.
Right.
All you're a student, you have an ID, you come on, you show your ID, you're on the bus.
So you mentioned that as a short-term possibility. Now, in the long term, what do you see as the future of transportation in the San Fernando Valley? In the long
I think we have to build the north-south connectors. We got to get a route to LAX. We have to get the orange line at the most efficient and biggest throughput possible. Excuse me. And we have to build more jobs out there. A lot of the people coming over the hills, 405 and even the 101, are headed to job sites away from their housing. So trying to put more jobs closer to housing, which is another struggle, as you know, that we've had here, is an important strategic objective in the medium to longer term.
Okay. That was. What would you do to reduce congestion on the west side? That's a big topic.
But you have to build more housing here so that to some extent people can live near their work. I think that the completion of the light rail, we have to see what happens there. I think it'll be wildly used, personally. But some people don't. Some people think, oh no, it's not that many people are going to use it. But I think they're wrong. I think people are already using it. I know people who drive to Culver City, park their car, get on and go downtown on the light rail today. You know, so I think it'll be very strongly used. It'll be interesting to see what happens to the traffic here. But the longer range thing is to build housing and jobs together so people don't have these vast distances to commute to get to work.
Right. What have you done on affordable housing issues?
Well, I voted in Santa Monica for the Community Corp financing, and as far as I know, for every 100% affordable project that ever came before the council.
Community Corporation is?
The nonprofit housing developer of the city of Santa Monica. When we get redevelopment money, we finance in a very strong way. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the answer. And I voted for them, I promoted it. I was particularly interested in what they call purchase and rehab. So buying facilities where people were already living in the community, bringing them up to code in a better way, allowing current residents to stay in their current housing. But it's clear now in LA that new housing needs to be built on a very broad basis. Rents have gone totally ridiculous. And you have 2 or 3 families and people packed into living rooms and garages. In the Northeast Valley, you have families living in garages. A couple of families in the garage, a couple of families in the house. This is unsustainable and we need new construction.
So as a supervisor and member of the Metro Board of Directors, how can you help address the need for more affordable housing and market rate housing throughout LA County and your district?
Well, as to affordable housing, some of the boomerang funds which are coming back could be put into a rolling equity fund perhaps for affordable housing construction.
Boomerang funds, could you specify?
Boomerang funds are the funds coming back from the tax increment that when redevelopment got dissolved, some money is going to come back. So, and those are pretty sizable numbers for the county and for the city of Los Angeles. So what the government is going to do with them, you can put them into the general fund, but I strongly favor putting them into a facility to create more affordable housing. work with the nonprofit developers to do that. As to market rate, the market rate people are pretty good when they can run their numbers at building market rates. I don't think they need a whole lot of assistance personally, although I think the red tape in a lot of housing construction adds to its cost in a pretty dramatic way, and people will underestimate the cost of carrying projects for many years before you can build them, and they don't understand perhaps that the money spent carrying a project for 6 or 7 years then has to be go into the rent calculation. So why are rents so high? Maybe because it took 10 years to build the project. So some way of expediting the construction of rental multifamily housing has to happen. I know there's a lot of opposition to that, but it has to happen. The people are here living 4 families to a house in the Northeast Valley, so something's got to give. I don't have a number of units goal like we had in Santa Monica. We had an actual number of units. I don't have a number of units. I have more of a capital goal. Okay. So I like to get a certain amount of money into a program whereby the nonprofit developers can come and build affordable housing, and sites, work with cities to see where sites might be for affordable housing construction, work with communities, listen to the communities. Where do you think you would like this housing built? If the county could partner with your city or some developers in your city, how can we put the right amount of money together to build the units? And there's a lot of there's some exciting stuff happening, for example, in the health department of the county, where some now people who are living in hospitals at $3,000 a day, the county is experimenting with taking those people and putting them into supported housing that the county is building with that savings, because then when you're in the housing, it costs obviously much less than $3,000 a day to live in there, and that savings finances the construction of the housing. That's a very hopeful idea. It needs to be brought to scale, meaning it needs to be bigger than 20 or 30 units, and it needs to be dispersed throughout the county. But I think there are pots of money that could support supportive housing and general affordable housing and workforce housing closer to job centers than there are. And I look forward to working with the cities, particularly the city of Los Angeles, because in the 3rd district, as I know you know, about 75 or 80% of the district is the city of Los Angeles. So having a close working relationship with the city, the elected leaders, many of whom have endorsed me, the elected leaders of the city council, the mayor, and figuring out how to have the county work with the city housing administration is a very important collaborative project that I'm looking forward to working on.
So you mentioned pots of money. Where do you have any specific?
But there's an interesting one in the health department.
Right.
I mean, you never would think the health department is going to start building affordable housing or supported housing, and yet, in fact, already they were housing people, but they were housing them in hospitals. So the smart person who was in charge of that looked at that and said, hey, wait a minute, I'm in the housing business. I'm supposed to be in the health business, but I'm actually in the housing business because these people are sick. They don't need to be in a hospital, but they need some supportive services. So I'm going to take them out of the hospital, take the savings that I get from taking them out of the hospital, and build supportive housing for them. So they just went from the health business into the health business as supportive housing business. So stuff like that, when you think different, it's like my RED project. People wanted us to get the private sector involved in HIV. So instead of going and asking people for money, could you please give me money for HIV, we developed products like batteries for iPhones, or sneakers that we could sell, or watches that we could sell, or coffee. Starbucks, you use the RED card, a nickel goes for healthcare. So there are ways of putting smart ideas and new solutions into social issues that I hope I can bring to the county when I'm elected. Okay. That's why I like the blog, because when you read the blog, you were like, wow, there's some clever stuff on here. I need to talk to a couple of these people. So I'm an active seeker of information from people who are activists, from local city council members, and I believe the job is a local job. You have to want to go out into the community and listen to people. You don't want to sit downtown in the office building and dictate policy to people.
Right. Cap and trade funds.
Well, there's everybody trying to get the cap and trade money, because there's a pot of money and everybody wants to get it. So I think it's going to be a bit of a, what's the right way of putting it, a brawl over the money. And I think that I think the housing and transportation issues are the two biggest issues, other than water, but the two biggest issues where the county can have a significant impact on the quality of life. So I'm willing to get into that brawl. Instinctively, I tend to kind of go away from brawls and try to find the money somewhere else where someone doesn't see the money. Just like, red. Red is a thing where people didn't see the nickel on the Starbucks coffee or the $20 on these shoes. They thought, well, that money doesn't really exist.
Right.
But when you study things, you can see like, ooh, there's money over here. You don't really, not everybody sees the money. But if you think of it this way, you see it and you move the money over here, and all of a sudden people are like, wow, how'd you make $250 million selling stuff? Answer, we made up a brand, we put blah, blah, blah. So, I'm instinctively drawn to try to find the money in places where there's not everybody in there trying to get it.
Right. So you mentioned son of Measure R, and during your first term, if elected, it is likely the measure will present a new ballot measure to fund more transportation projects.
Yep.
Move LA's Measure R2 strawman proposal includes about 4% for walking and bicycling, plus access to bike facilities and pedestrian facilities being built into rail projects. How much of the future ballot measure should be set aside for bicycle and pedestrian improvements?
As much as is necessary to make the transportation work. So whether it's bicycle and pedestrian improvements or shuttles to bring people to stops where there's no parking, that has to be done because the main lines, the ridership needs to rise to the level so that we can expedite the funding of the transit that is not yet secured. As you know, in the Purple Line, for example, the funding is secured to a certain place and then it's not secure. And under the current system, it's not a system really, under current circumstances, until work will stop and wait for the money, which I think is a mistake, right? I think we should figure out a way to have that work continue so you keep the workers working, you keep the drills in the ground, and work progresses. But that requires some rejiggering of the financing, even including the straw man proposal stuff. And I think it's very important to do that because you have to have the ridership to get the federal money. You have to be able to show that, and however you're going to get there, whether by bike, by by pedestrians, or by local shuttles, which would take people to the trains, it has to be done. And I think it will be done. And I think it's cheap. Honestly, the big money is putting that big drill bit in the ground and hundreds of people working. That's big money.
There was also mentioned recently, I think on Move LA's, wrote an op-ed for Streetsblog of Measure R2 funding for housing. Do you think that's a viable option?
Viable, I would say to you, is not the right question. The real question is political, which is to pass it. What does it need to have in it to pass? And it sounds like a craven answer, but really we want it to pass. So there are sophisticated people polling, running like a political campaign, the campaign for that. And if to pass it, there needs to be housing money in it, they'll find out that that is something that the public favor, and they'll put it in.
All right, one last question.
I think it's very important that passes, and that I don't mean to minimize it by saying that, it's a political matter. And I think it's very important because the polls and the outreach to people is a way of gathering information about what the public want and are willing to support, and you just have to get that right.
Right. One last question, bonus question, if you will. If you could wave a magic wand and instantly change any one thing about Los Angeles County transportation, what would it be?
I'd have the 101. I don't know, I'd call it a monorail, but I'd have some sort of train facility in the valley that zipped across the valley. I just, when I go there, and which I've done a lot of, and see the congestion on the 101, 134 there, it's like, oh my God. I mean, the 405 is bad. The 405 is bad, but I think the wand in the valley would be better.
Okay. Great. Well, thanks for your time.
Thank you, Jason. Always.